The weed that fed pioneers, but still grows in your backyard. It grows at the edge of gardens, in the cracks between flagstones, along fence lines, and in the corners of fields that have been left unattended for a single season. Most people who encounter it reach down without thinking and pull it out. What most people don't realize is that this same plant once helped feed entire households. The plant is unremarkable in appearance. Nothing about it announces its history. There are no signs, no labels, no indication that for centuries it was not ignored but sought, that people crossed fields to find it, that households depended on it during the weeks when the garden had not yet produced anything worth eating. Something that fed families across continents now disappears quietly into yard waste bags every summer. Not because it stopped being useful, not because it became dangerous, simply because the knowledge of what it was gradually stopped being passed down. So why did a plant once important enough to sustain early settlers through the lean weeks of spring become something that most modern gardeners remove before they even consider what it might be? Some knowledge was never lost. It was simply waiting to be remembered. In this film, we trace the history of lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album, from its role as a dependable food source across multiple cultures to its current status as one of the most commonly removed weeds in the home garden. We follow the historical record, the nutritional evidence, and the quiet persistence of a plant that has outlasted every agricultural system that tried to replace it. Lamb's quarters is not a rare plant. It grows on every inhabited continent. It appears in disturbed soil, in gardens, in fields, along roadsides, and in vacant lots. It thrives in conditions that would slow or stop the growth of more demanding vegetables. Heat, poor drainage, compacted earth, and low fertility do not stop it. They may slow it slightly, but the plant continues. Botanically, it belongs to the Chenopodiaceae family, the same family as beets, spinach, and Swiss chard. That connection is visible in the leaves. They are soft, slightly dusty in texture, and shaped with gentle lobes. When young, they have a faint silvery or white coating, a natural waxy layer that gives the plant one of its older regional names, white goosefoot. The flavor, when the leaves are eaten raw or cooked, is mild and green, similar to spinach, though with a slightly more mineral quality. The plant grows quickly. In favorable conditions, it can reach 4 feet or taller within a single season. It flowers in late summer, producing small, dense clusters of seed that are technically edible and nutritionally dense. A single mature plant can disperse tens of thousands of seeds, which is part of why it returns reliably to the same ground year after year, and part of why it frustrates gardeners who try to eliminate it entirely. But before lamb's quarters became a problem to be managed, it was a resource to be used. And the history of how it was used is both longer and more geographically widespread than most people would expect. Archaeological evidence for the use of Chenopodium species as food extends back several thousand years across multiple regions. In North America, seeds from related plants have been recovered from excavation sites across the eastern and southwestern United States, dating to periods well before European contact. The evidence suggests that both the seeds and the leaves were consumed, with the seeds sometimes processed into flour or meal. In Europe, similar patterns appear. Plant remains recovered from prehistoric sites in Switzerland, Denmark, and parts of Britain show Chenopodium seeds alongside other gathered plant foods. The species was documented growing in and around human settlements, and the proximity was almost certainly not accidental. Plants that produced edible material were tolerated, cultivated informally, or actively encouraged near dwellings in a practice that modern researchers sometimes call dooryard gardening. Lamb's quarters fits that description well. The relationship between the plant and the people who used it was practical. Lamb's quarters emerged early in the growing season, often before cultivated vegetables were ready to harvest. In the weeks between the last frost and the first reliable harvest from a kitchen garden, gathered greens from plants like lamb's quarters filled a gap that would otherwise mean reduced variety and reduced nutrition. Early settlers in North America recognized this. Historical accounts and period documents describe the gathering of wild greens in spring, with lamb's quarters frequently listed alongside plants like dandelion, sorrel, and watercress. The pattern held across the Atlantic as well. In parts of rural Europe, particularly in regions where winters were long and the transition to spring was a lean period for food, gathered greens were not considered unusual or a sign of poverty. They were considered sensible, a family that knew which plants emerged early and which were safe to eat, was a family better positioned to maintain its health through a difficult season. What made lamb's quarters particularly useful was not just that it was edible, but that it was nutritionally substantial. Modern laboratory analysis of Chenopodium album leaves reveals a composition that compares favorably to spinach and other cultivated greens. The plant contains meaningful concentrations of calcium, iron, potassium, and vitamins A and C. The protein content of the leaves is relatively high for a leafy green, and the plant provides dietary fiber as well. The seeds tell a related story. The genus Chenopodium includes quinoa, Chenopodium quinoa, a plant cultivated for thousands of years in the Andean highlands of South America and now grown and sold around the world as a high-protein grain. Lamb's quarters belongs to the same genus. In other words, the plant that many gardeners pull out of their beds without a second thought is closely related to one of the most celebrated health foods of the modern era. The seeds of lamb's quarters are smaller and require more processing than quinoa, but they share some of the same nutritional characteristics, including a protein profile that contains amino acids less common in typical cereal grains. This connection is not coincidental. The same qualities that made quinoa worth domesticating and cultivating across the Andes were present in varying degrees across the Chenopodium genus. In North America, archaeological evidence suggests that a related species, Chenopodium berlandieri, was cultivated as a grain crop in parts of the eastern continent before being largely abandoned, with the shift attributed to the spread of maize agriculture, which offered greater yields under intensive farming conditions. What this means in practical terms is that lamb's quarters, the plant that grows uninvited at the edge of a modern garden, is not far removed botanically or nutritionally from plants that agricultural systems once considered worth cultivating. The distance between a weed and a crop is often a matter of context rather than inherent quality. The transition that moved lamb's quarters from useful plant to dismissed weed happened gradually, and it happened for reasons that were largely structural rather than based on any particular judgment about the plant itself. As agriculture became more organized and specialized across both Europe and North America, the value placed on gathered or foraged plants declined relative to cultivated ones. This was not an overnight shift. It happened across generations, driven by changes in land use, changes in the food supply, and changes in what counted as reliable provision. When cultivated vegetables became available through most of the growing season, the early season gap that lamb's quarters had historically filled became less significant. Canned goods, improved storage, and eventually refrigeration further reduced the practical need for gathered greens. A household that could purchase spinach or lettuce in early spring had less reason to know which wild plants were edible and nutritious. At the same time, the expansion of large-scale agriculture created a new context in which plants that grew without invitation were primarily understood as competitors. In a field planted to a single cash crop, any other plant growing in that space was a problem to be eliminated. Lamb's quarters, which grows quickly and competes effectively for soil nutrients, became an agricultural weed, a designation that has more to do with economics and land management than with the plant's inherent characteristics. The knowledge did not vanish entirely. In parts of the world where traditional food practices remained central, lamb's quarters and its relatives continued to be gathered and eaten. In South Asia, the plant is known by various regional names and consumed as a cooked green, sometimes referred to in English as bathua. In parts of Central Asia and the Middle East, related species have remained part of traditional diets. In Mexico and Central America, Chenopodium species are still gathered and prepared in some regions, continuing practices that predate colonial contact. In the first link of the description, there is a practical guide for those who want to learn more about identifying and cultivating these plants alongside their regular gardens. But in much of the industrialized world, particularly in North America and Western Europe, the transmission of knowledge about lamb's quarters stopped somewhere in the 20th century. Not because anyone decided it should stop, but because the circumstances that had made the knowledge useful were replaced by circumstances that made it seem unnecessary. What happens when that replacement is not as complete or as secure as it appears? This is the question that has brought renewed attention to plants like lamb's quarters in recent years, though the attention has come from a different direction than simple nostalgia. Researchers studying food system resilience, the capacity of food supplies to remain functional under conditions of disruption, have taken an interest in traditional and foraged plant foods not as alternatives to modern agriculture, but as complements to it. The argument is not that people should abandon cultivated vegetables for gathered weeds. It is more modest than that. It is that a food system in which most people lack the knowledge to identify even the most nutritious and common edible plants growing around them is a food system with a particular kind of vulnerability. Not a dramatic vulnerability, but a quiet one. Small-scale growers working outside mainstream commercial agriculture have also contributed to a renewed interest in plants like lamb's quarters. Gardeners and farmers practicing low-input or regenerative approaches have found value in plants that produce without requiring much in return. Lamb's quarters does not need to be sown. It does not need to be fertilized. It tolerates neglect. For a small garden aiming to produce food with minimal external inputs, a plant that volunteers reliably and provides a nutritious early-season green is genuinely useful. Some seed companies now offer cultivated varieties of Chenopodium album selected for larger leaves and more compact growth, marketed as garden greens rather than as curiosities. The interest is modest but real, and it reflects a broader pattern in which plants that industrial agriculture moved away from are being re-examined on their own terms. The plant has not changed. Lamb's quarters growing in a garden today is nutritionally and biologically the same as the plant gathered by early settlers in North America, by households in medieval Europe, by communities in South Asia, and by the cultures that grew its botanical relatives across the Americas long before European contact. What has changed is the frame through which people look at it. Naming something a weed is an act of categorization, not a statement of inherent quality. The category reflects what a particular agricultural or economic system finds useful or unwelcome at a given time. Plants move in and out of these categories depending on context. Quinoa, the close relative of lamb's quarters, was treated as a marginal crop for most of the 20th century, cultivated mainly in Andean communities. Within a generation, it became a commercially significant global commodity. The plant did not change. The context did. Lamb's quarters may not follow the same path. It has no particular commercial momentum behind it, and its smallness and informality make it unlikely to become a supermarket product. But that is not the only measure of a plant's value. For a household with a garden, or for a community working to understand what grows in its local environment, knowing that lamb's quarters is edible and nutritious is knowledge that costs nothing and requires nothing beyond attention. If you want to go further, the practical guide in the first link of the description covers how to identify lamb's quarters reliably, how to harvest it through the season, and how to prepare it in a variety of traditional and modern ways. Every summer, across millions of gardens and yards, lamb's quarters grows without being asked. It appears in the spaces between cultivated plants, at the edges of beds, along fences, in the strips of soil beside walkways. Most of it is removed and discarded. A small amount is noticed, identified, and eaten. The history documented here did not disappear. The nutritional value did not disappear. The plant did not disappear. What became less common is the knowledge of how to see it clearly, and the habit of considering whether something growing without cultivation might still be worth using. That habit sustained people across a very long stretch of human history, in many different places, under many different conditions. It did not survive because it was romantic or ideological. It survived because it was practical. The knowledge is still here. The plant is still here. Sometimes the difference between a weed and a resource is nothing more than whether someone remembers what it is. What each person does with that is a quiet, ordinary decision, made in the same places where ordinary decisions about food have always been made. In gardens, in kitchens, and in the gap between what we assume we know and what we actually look at.